1945. The Texas desert. The sound of rain hammering against canvas. The ragged breathing of a woman who believes she is about to die. Inside a small military tent, a young Japanese woman sits pressed into the far corner, her knees drawn up to her chest, her fingers wrapped around a jagged stone. She grips it so tightly that the edges cut into her palm. She does not feel the pain. Pain is a luxury for those who have time. She does not have time. She has only this moment, this stone, and the silhouette of an American soldier standing at the entrance to the tent. She is 23 years old. Her name is Yumi Asakura. She has traveled 6,000 miles from Kyoto to die in a place she cannot even pronounce. Everything she was ever taught about American soldiers is running through her mind like a newsreel of horrors. They are demons. They are monsters. They do unspeakable things to captured women. The man who brought her here told her she would sleep in his tent. She understood those words perfectly. She understood exactly what they meant. But what happens in the next 24 hours will shatter everything she believes. It will break apart a lifetime of propaganda and plant a seed that will grow for 40 years across an ocean. It will prove that even in the darkest chapters of human history, there are moments when ordinary people choose to be extraordinary. This is the story of one night in the Texas desert. One decision, one act of simple decency that echoed through generations. But to understand how Yumi Asakura ended up in that tent, clutching that stone, preparing to fight for her life, we need to go back 72 hours, back to a convoy rolling through the dust and heat of the Lone Star State, back to a time when she still believed that every American was her enemy. The year is 1945 and the world is on fire. In Europe, Allied forces are pushing toward Berlin. In the Pacific, American Marines are dying on islands most people have never heard of. And here in the heart of Texas, a different kind of war is being waged, a quiet war, a war of perception. More than 400,000 prisoners of war are being held on American soil. German soldiers, Italian soldiers, Japanese soldiers. They work on farms, pick cotton, herd cattle. They eat American food, sleep in American barracks, and slowly begin to question everything their leaders told them about the enemy. Camp Hearn, located in the rolling plains of central Texas, holds over 4,000 prisoners. It is one of dozens of camps scattered across the state. The prisoners call Texas the land of impossible space because the horizon seems to stretch forever in every direction. For men and women who grew up in the crowded cities of Europe and Japan, the emptiness is both terrifying and beautiful. But outside the camp fences, the desert holds its own dangers. Rattlesnakes and scorpions, heat that can kill a man in hours, and something worse, something human. Deserters. Men who abandoned the American army and now live like bandits in the canyons and arroyos. Men for whom the rules of civilization no longer apply. Men who prey on the vulnerable and leave no witnesses. Into this landscape, a military convoy is carrying 47 Japanese prisoners from the port of Galveston to Camp Hearn. Most are wounded soldiers and medical personnel captured from a hospital ship in the Pacific. Among them are 5 women, all of them nurses, all of them civilians, and one of them is Yumi Asakura. She sits in the corner of the transport truck, her back against the wooden slats that rattle with every bump in the road. The Texas sun beats down on the canvas cover, turning the interior into an oven. Sweat trickles down her neck, soaking into the collar of her simple cotton uniform. Around her, the other prisoners sit in various states of exhaustion and despair. Some have bandages wrapped around their heads or limbs. Some stare at nothing, their minds still trapped in the horrors they witnessed at sea. The smell of unwashed bodies and dried blood hangs in the air like a fog. Yumi does not speak to anyone. She has not spoken more than a few words since she received the letter 8 months ago. The letter that destroyed everything. The woman sitting next to her is named Fumiko. She is 50 years old with grey-streaked hair and kind eyes that have seen too much suffering. She was the head nurse on the hospital ship, and she has taken it upon herself to watch over the younger women. Fumiko leans close and whispers in Japanese, her voice low and careful. They say the Americans treat prisoners well. According to their Geneva Convention, we will have food and shelter and medical care. Yumi does not respond. But we are women, Fumiko continues, her voice dropping even lower. The rules are sometimes different for women. We must be careful. We must stay together. Yumi finally turns to look at the older woman. Her eyes are flat, emptied out. The eyes of someone who has already made peace with the worst. It does not matter what they do to me, she says quietly. Fumiko's expression shifts with concern. Do not say such things. Your father is waiting for you in Kyoto. You must survive for him. At the mention of her father, something flickers in Yumi's expression, a crack in the armor she has built around her heart. But it closes just as quickly. My father has already lost everything, she says. He lost my mother when Kenji was born, and now he has lost Kenji. She does not say the rest. She does not need to. The name alone carries the full weight of it. Fumiko reaches out to touch her hand, but the truck hits a deep pothole and throws them both sideways. By the time they recover, the moment has passed. Yumi is staring at the canvas wall again, her eyes seeing something far away, something that is not Texas at all. She is thinking about Kenji, her little brother, the boy with the quick smile and the clumsy handwriting who used to follow her around their house in Kyoto like a shadow, the boy who collected beetles in the summer and paper cranes in the winter, the boy who was 17 years old when he enlisted in the Imperial Army because the recruiters told him it was his duty, his honor, his destiny. The boy who died in a training camp 300 miles from any battlefield, killed by American bombs before he ever learned to fire a rifle. The letter arrived on an autumn morning. Yumi was thousands of miles away on the hospital ship, bandaging wounds and holding the hands of dying men. Her father opened the envelope alone in their house in Kyoto. He read the words alone. He wept alone. By the time Yumi learned of her brother's death, it was already history. Cold, distant, irreversible. She could not go home for the funeral. She could not hold her father while he cried. She could only stand on the deck of the ship and stare at the endless grey ocean, thinking about the Americans who had dropped those bombs. From that day forward, every time she saw an American flag, she saw only one thing: the people who killed her brother. And now she is in their country, on their soil, surrounded by their soldiers, breathing their air. She hates them all. 30 miles to the west, in a small outpost on the edge of the desert, a very different kind of man is writing a very different kind of letter. Garrett Kavanaugh sits in his tent with a pencil in his hand and a sheet of paper balanced on his knee. He is 26 years old, with dark hair and brown eyes, and the kind of broad shoulders that come from a childhood of hauling bricks and mixing mortar alongside his father. His uniform is faded from too many washings. There is a scar on his left forearm that he got when he was 14, climbing a fence. He had no business climbing. He has been working on this letter for the better part of an hour, and he has crossed out more words than he has kept. Dear Nora, the letter begins. I know you're going to roll your eyes when I tell you about the sunsets out here, but I'm telling you anyway. They turn the whole sky red and purple, like somebody spilled a bucket of paint from one end of the horizon to the other. I wish you could see them. He pauses, reads what he has written. Then he crosses out the last sentence. Oh, I wish I was there. I wish I was sitting on the front steps with you, listening to Papa tell those stories about the old country that we've both heard 100 times. The ones about the village and the olive trees and great-grandmother's cooking. I never thought I'd miss those stories. I miss them now. He stops writing. The pencil hovers over the paper as memories flood through him. Columbus, Ohio. The neighborhood south of downtown where his family settled when his grandfather came over from Sicily in 1908 and changed the family name from Cavanaro to Kavanaugh because somebody at the immigration office told him it would be easier. Easier for whom his grandfather always muttered, but he kept the name anyway. The neighborhood smelled of garlic and cigarette smoke and fresh-cut lumber. Everyone knew everyone. Children played in the streets until their mothers called them in for supper. Sunday mornings meant mass and then a long afternoon at the table, eating and arguing in equal measure. His father, Enzo Kavanaugh, was a bricklayer with hands like slabs of stone and a laugh that could rattle the windows. His mother, Cecilia, made pasta from scratch every Friday and sang old Sicilian songs in a voice that was completely off-key and absolutely perfect. And then there was Nora, his little sister, 7 years younger than him, which meant she was 9 years old when the polio came. The summer of 1937. Garrett closes his eyes, and he is back there in an instant. The small bedroom with the white curtains, the smell of antiseptic that clung to everything for months. Nora, lying in her bed, staring at the ceiling with the specific stillness of someone who has just been told that their body has become a stranger to them. He was 16 years old, and he did not know what to say. So he sat beside her on the edge of the bed and took her hands in his and said the only thing that felt true. I'm not going anywhere, Nora. Whatever you need, wherever you need to go, I'll get you there. I promise. She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were dry. She had already cried herself out. But something in her expression shifted, some small piece of the terror loosening its grip. You promise? I promise, and I'll make you another one while I'm at it. I will never walk away from someone who can't protect themselves, not as long as I'm breathing. He kept that promise for 8 years. He carried her to school on his back when the weather made her wheelchair impossible. He built a wooden ramp for the front door that his father pretended he hadn't needed help designing. He sat with her on summer evenings on that same front porch, talking about everything and nothing, her legs useless and her mind sharper than anyone he had ever met. He fought 2 boys in the 9th grade who thought it was funny to mimic the way she moved her hands when she spoke. He lost the second fight badly, came home with a split lip and a black eye, and Nora had laughed so hard she nearly fell out of her wheelchair. Then the war came, and he had to leave. He opens his eyes and looks down at the letter. The words have gone blurry. He blinks hard to clear them. I miss you, Nora. I miss your laugh and your terrible taste in music and the way you throw things at me when I disagree with you, which is most of the time. I miss our parents. I miss home. He pauses. Then he adds one more line at the bottom, pressing the pencil down harder than necessary, as if the words need to be anchored to the page. I will come back. I promise. He folds the letter, slides it into an envelope and writes his sister's name on the front, in the careful block letters he learned in Catholic school. Outside the tent, the sun is beginning its descent, pulling long shadows across the desert floor and painting the sky in colors that he still cannot find the right words for. The radio crackles. Outpost 9, this is command. Come in, Outpost 9. Garrett reaches for the handset. This is Outpost 9. Go ahead, command. Psst. The voice on the other end is clipped and tense. We have a situation. Transport convoy was hit about 20 miles east of your position. Possible deserter ambush. Multiple casualties, some prisoners unaccounted for. There may be women among the missing. Garrett feels his stomach tighten. He knows about the deserters. He has heard the stories. He knows what men like that are capable of when they find someone alone and defenseless in the desert. He writes down the coordinates. The voice on the radio reminds him to wait for backup. Backup is 2 hours out. He clicks off the handset and stands. He checks his M1 Garand with the automatic efficiency of a man who has done it 10,000 times. Round in the chamber, full clip. He pulls on his jacket, picks up a canteen, and steps out of the tent into the dying light. He does not wait for backup. There is a woman out there somewhere alone in the dark. That is all he needs to know. The ambush came without warning. One moment, the convoy was rolling through a narrow canyon passage, engines rumbling low over the broken road. The next moment, the world came apart. The lead truck hit a homemade mine buried just beneath the surface of the dirt. The explosion lifted the vehicle and slammed it sideways, scattering men and supplies across the road in a single, terrible second. Before the echo had finished rolling off the canyon walls, gunfire erupted from the ridgeline above. Not the disciplined fire of soldiers. Something wilder, more erratic, the fire of men who were enjoying themselves. Yumi was thrown hard against the side of the truck as the vehicle swerved. She heard screaming in Japanese and English tangled together into something that didn't sound like language at all. She smelled smoke burning rubber, and then underneath everything, the thin copper smell of blood. Fumiko grabbed her arm and pulled her flat against the truck bed floor. Through a tear in the canvas, Yumi could see the men on the ridgeline. They wore pieces of military uniform, mixed with civilian clothing, patched and dirty. One of them was laughing. She could see his shoulders shaking with it, even from a distance. These were not soldiers. She understood that immediately. These were something else, something that operated outside any code she recognized. A bullet punched through the canvas 6 inches above her head. The woman to her left made a soft sound and went still. Fumiko was already moving, already calculating. She had the focused calm of someone who had spent years making decisions in rooms where people were dying. When I say go, she said quietly, her mouth close to Yumi's ear. We go. The rocks on the other side of the road. Do you see them? Yumi saw them. Go. They scrambled over the tailgate and dropped to the ground. The sand was hot under Yumi's palms even in the late afternoon. They ran bent low, using the burning truck as cover for as long as it would give them cover. Yumi could hear American soldiers returning fire from behind the remaining vehicles, but there were not enough of them and the angles were wrong, and she could tell from the sound of it that they were losing. They were almost to the rocks when Fumiko stumbled. Yumi turned. The older woman was on her knees in the sand, one hand pressed flat against her chest, her face carrying an expression of mild surprise, as if something unexpected but not entirely unwelcome had just occurred to her. No, Yumi whispered. The word came out small and helpless. Fumiko's hand reached toward her. Her eyes were already beginning to change, some inner light dimming by degrees. Run, she said. Her voice was still steady, still the voice of a woman who had spent 30 years telling frightened people what to do and meaning it. Run, child, do not stop. I cannot leave you here. You can. The hand dropped to the sand. You must. Survive. Survive for all of us. Her eyes closed. Yumi wanted to stay. She wanted to hold the woman who had been kind to her. She wanted to weep and rage against the absolute unfairness of it. But Fumiko's last command was still echoing in her ears, louder than the gunfire, louder than everything. Run! So she ran. She ran until her lungs were burning and her legs were shaking and the sound of the fighting had faded to something distant and irrelevant. She ran past rocks and cactus and the bleached bones of animals that had died in this merciless place. She ran until the sun finished setting and the stars came out and the temperature dropped off a cliff, the desert's warmth evaporating into the vast dark sky as if it had never existed at all. She ran until she could not run anymore. When she finally stopped collapsing behind a large boulder with her back against the stone and her chest heaving, she had no idea where she was. The convoy was gone. The other prisoners were gone. Fumiko was gone. She was alone in the Texas desert with no water, no food, and no direction. 2 days passed. 2 days of walking through a landscape that seemed specifically designed to kill her. The sun rose each morning with a kind of relentless authority, baking the sand until it shimmered at the edges of her vision. The nights were something else, entirely cold, that came fast and bit deep, the kind of cold that felt personal. She found water in the cracks of flat rocks, tiny pools left from some rain that must have fallen weeks ago. She learned to break cactus pads against a sharp rock and scrape out the bitter flesh inside. She learned that the desert was not empty, but full of life that had adapted itself to survive through patience and economy, and that she was none of those things. At night, she looked up at the stars and talked to the people who were gone. She talked to Kenji. Mostly she apologized to him. She was sorry she had not been there. She was sorry she had not found a way to stop it. She knew that was not reasonable, that there was nothing she could have done from the deck of a hospital ship in the middle of the Pacific. But grief is not a reasonable thing, and she had been carrying this specific grief for 8 months without anyone to set it down in front of, and in the dark of the Texas desert, with no one listening, she finally let herself say the things she had been holding. I am sorry. I am sorry I could not save you. I am sorry I could not bring you home. The stars did not answer. They never do. But the saying of it mattered anyway. By the morning of the 3rd day, Yumi knew she was running out of time. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her vision blurred at the edges when she stood up too fast. She had been keeping track of her condition the way her nursing training had taught her, cataloguing symptoms with the detached professionalism of someone assessing a patient, and the assessment was not good. She sat in the thin, early shade of a boulder and tried to think clearly about her options, and she was still doing that when she heard the laughter. It was not the laughter of people who were happy. She turned and saw 3 men coming around the far side of a rock formation, moving without urgency, the way men move when they are certain of the outcome. 2 had knives hanging from their belts. 1 carried a rifle loose in one hand, the barrel pointed at the ground. He had a scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, an old wound healed badly. He looked at her and smiled. Yumi reached down without looking and picked up the sharpest rock she could find. She closed her fingers around it, feeling the edges cut into her palm, and she stood up straight. She did not run. There was nowhere to run. And she had made a decision somewhere in the long, cold nights behind her that she would not spend her last moments begging. If this was the end, she would meet it on her feet. The man with the scar said something in English that she caught pieces of, but did not need to fully understand. His tone translated itself. His companions spread out to either side, cutting off the angles patient, and practiced. Yumi raised the stone. She was still raising it when the shot came, a single crack, deep and flat and final. The bullet struck the sand 18 inches from the scarred man's left boot, and the sound of it hit him like a physical thing. He jumped back and his eyes snapped up and to the right, all the easy confidence gone in an instant. From behind a low rise 20 yards out, a figure rose, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in the olive drab of the United States Army, his uniform dusty and sweat-stained. He held an M1 Garand at his shoulder with the calm steadiness of a man who had done this many times and was not excited about it, just decided. He did not speak. He looked at the 3 men the way you look at a calculation you've already finished. The scarred man held his gaze for a long 5 seconds, then cut a look at his companions and made the arithmetic himself. He turned and walked away back the way he had come, and the others followed. Before he disappeared over the rise, he looked back once. "This isn't finished," he said. Then he was gone. Yumi stood very still. The stone still raised her heart, hitting the inside of her chest hard enough that she could feel it in her fingertips. She looked at the American soldier as he lowered his rifle and turned toward her. He was younger than she expected. His face was smeared with dust, and several days of stubble, and his eyes were brown and held no cruelty in them. They held something she was not sure she had a word for in any language, something that looked at a distance like concern. He took a step toward her, and she flinched backward. He stopped, raised one hand, palm out, the universal gesture that predates every language. "Easy," he said. His voice was quiet and even. "I'm not going to hurt you." She did not lower the stone. He pointed to himself. "Garrett." Then he pointed at her, a question in his eyes. She said nothing. He looked at the sky, judging the light, then looked back at her. He spoke slowly, the way you speak to someone when you're not sure how much they understand, and you can't afford to be misunderstood. "Come with me. I have a camp. It's safe." She did not move. He exhaled, a long, tired sound. And he tried again, using his hands to illustrate each word, his face careful and deliberate. "I have a tent." He pointed at her, then made the gesture of someone sleeping, head tilted onto folded hands. Then he pointed west again. "You will sleep in my tent." The words hit Yumi like cold water. She understood every one of them. Sleep, tent, his tent. And every piece of propaganda she had ever been fed came flooding back in an instant. Every warning, every story, every official pronouncement about what American soldiers did to captured women. This man had not saved her from the deserters. He had simply gotten there first. Her blood went cold. The stone came back up. But the desert behind her was 3 days of dying in every direction. The men with the knives were still out there somewhere, and this soldier, with his steady eyes and his rifle, was the only option left. She would go with him. She would wait for her moment. And if he tried to touch her, she would drive this stone into the side of his head and take her chances with the desert. She lowered the stone to her side. She did not let go of it. The American nodded once. Then he turned and began walking west. And after a moment, Yumi Asakura followed him into the last light of the dying day. She did not know his name yet, beyond that single word he had offered. She did not know about his sister Nora, or the promise he had made in a small bedroom in Columbus 10 years ago. She knew only that she was still alive, and that the night was coming, and that somewhere ahead, in a small tent beneath a sandstone overhang, she would finally learn whether everything she had ever been taught about Americans was true. The camp was nothing. That was the first thing Yumi understood when they reached it. No barracks, no fences, no garrison of soldiers. Just a single canvas tent pitched beneath an overhang of sandstone rock, a few supply crates stacked against the stone wall, and a fire pit ringed with smooth rocks that had not held a fire in some time. To Garrett Kavanaugh, it was home, or the closest thing to it. To Yumi Asakura, it was a trap. She stood at the entrance and did not move until he gestured for her to enter his movements, unhurried. His expression carrying the particular patience of a man who understood that patience was the only tool available to him. She looked at the tent. She looked at the darkness pressing in from every direction. She thought about the 3 men with the knives. She stepped inside. The interior was small. A bedroll lay spread across the ground with a military blanket folded at its foot. A pack leaned against one wall, and everywhere the tools of war, ammunition boxes, a knife in a leather sheath, 2 canteens, a first aid kit, and the rifle, the M1 Garand, resting against the tent pole, closest to the entrance within easy reach. Yumi moved to the far corner. She lowered herself to the ground, pulled her knees to her chest, pressed her back against the canvas wall. The stone was still in her hand. She would not sleep. She would not close her eyes. The moment he reached for her, she would strike. Garrett ducked through the entrance, and the tent shrank immediately. He set the rifle down against his pack with careful deliberateness, not pointing it at her, not waving it around, just placing it exactly where it had been before, as if he wanted her to see that nothing had changed. He reached into one of the supply crates and pulled out a small tin, military crackers and processed cheese. He held it out toward her. She shook her head. He shrugged without offense and set the tin on the ground between them, equidistant like a small treaty. Then he took a few crackers for himself and began to eat, his eyes moving to the far wall of the tent. He did not look at her while he ate. He did not look at her at all. Yumi watched him with the full, unblinking attention of someone whose life depended on reading him correctly. She catalogued everything, the way he held the crackers, the way his eyes occasionally moved to the tent entrance, pausing there, listening for the desert outside. When he finished eating, he reached for the rifle. This is it, Yumi thought. Her grip on the stone tightened, but he did not point the rifle at her. He pulled a small cloth from his jacket pocket and began to clean the weapon, slowly, methodically. The sound it made was soft and rhythmic, a dry whisper of cloth against metal that filled the tent. She had seen this on the hospital ship. The wounded soldiers cleaning their sidearms from their beds, a meditation, a way of steadying the mind. She understood what it was. She understood it rationally, but watching it now from this corner with a stone in her palm, it looked like preparation. The careful preparation of a man who needed his weapon in perfect order for what came next. Tears began to build behind her eyes. She refused to let them fall. Outside, the wind picked up. Then the first drops of rain hit the canvas overhead, irregular at first, and then with sudden commitment a full downpour that hammered the tent with surprising violence. Garrett finished cleaning the rifle and reassembled it in the dark. He checked the action twice. The mechanical clicks were very loud in the confined space. Then he set the rifle across his lap and sat still with his eyes closed, his lips moving slightly. She watched him and thought with exhausted disbelief that he was praying. She had not considered the possibility that a monster might pray. When he opened his eyes, he reached for a folded poncho, shook it out and pulled it over his shoulders. He stood. He picked up the rifle. He moved toward the entrance. He paused with one hand on the canvas flap and turned to look at her. His eyes were tired. Not the tiredness of a single bad night, but something deeper. The tiredness of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time. He pointed at her, then at the ground beneath her. Then he made the sleeping gesture, his head tilted against his folded hands. "Sleep," he said. His voice was very quiet. "You're safe." Then he stepped out of the tent into the rain. Yumi sat perfectly still. She crawled to the entrance and pressed her eye against the gap where the flap met the frame. He was sitting with his back against a large rock about 10 feet from the tent. The poncho was pulled tight around his shoulders and his rifle rested across his thighs. His face was turned toward the desert, watching the darkness. The rain was coming down hard, hammering the ground and bouncing back up in small, pale explosions. Within minutes, the brim of his helmet was running like a small waterfall. He did not move. She sat back on her heels. He was outside, in the rain, in the cold. He had given her the only shelter he had. He had given her his blanket. He was sitting in a downpour in the dark desert in March because he had told her she would sleep in his tent, and apparently he had meant it in the simplest and most literal way possible, a way that had not crossed her mind for even a single second. She looked down at the stone in her hand. She thought about the tin of crackers placed equidistant between them. She thought about his eyes when he told her to sleep. Not hungry, not cruel, just tired. She uncurled her fingers. The stone dropped to the ground with a soft, final sound. She pulled the military blanket around her shoulders. It was rough against her skin, scratchy in the utilitarian way of things made for function, rather than comfort. It smelled of dust and gun oil and something faintly human. She sat with it wrapped around her and listened to the rain. She did not sleep yet. She let herself think about Kenji. She had been holding him at a distance for months, the only way to keep functioning. You build walls around the things that would break you, and you keep the walls in good repair and you keep moving. But the walls were thinner tonight. Something about this tent, this rain, this strange and disorienting evening had worn them down. She let herself remember him properly, the way he laughed high and sudden, like he was always surprised by his own amusement. The way he held a pen, gripping it too hard, pressing too deep into the paper so that his letters always had a slightly carved quality to them. The smell of the ink he used for his calligraphy practice, a black that was almost blue in certain lights. The specific expression on his face when he was trying to pretend he hadn't been crying, eyes too wide, jaw set too deliberately, a look she had known how to read since he was 4 years old. He had been 17, just 17, the age when the world should be opening up. The recruiters had come to his school with their uniforms pressed sharp and their speeches about duty and honor. Kenji had come home that day different, standing in the doorway of the kitchen with his chin up and his eyes bright, with something that might have been pride or might have been fear wearing pride's clothes. She had been angry at him. They had fought about it for 2 weeks and then she had been deployed, and she had never gotten to tell him that she was proud of him too, even if she thought he was wrong, even if she was terrified. She never got to tell him any of that. In the deepest part of the night, she looked out through the gap one more time. Garrett was still there. The rain had soaked through the poncho and plastered his uniform to his body. She could see him shivering from 10 feet away, a fine, constant tremor. His head moved in a slow arc left to right and back again, scanning the dark perimeter with the vigilance of a man who had learned not to trust stillness. What kind of enemy does this? She had been taught a very specific answer to that question. She had been told it so many times that it had stopped feeling like an answer and started feeling like a fact of nature. But this man was not behaving according to the catalogue. He had driven away 3 armed deserters with a single rifle shot and no backup. He had walked through the desert with a prisoner who was holding a rock and looking for the right moment to use it. He had offered her his food without condition and accepted her refusal without resentment. He had given her his only shelter, and he was sitting in a freezing rainstorm because he had told her she would be safe, and apparently he believed that a promise meant something even when no one was watching. The propaganda said all Americans were the same, but propaganda required you to never look too closely at any specific individual. It required distance, it required blurring, it required you to look at the uniform and never at the man wearing it. She had been looking at this man very closely, and what she saw did not match what she had been told. Not demons, not monsters, just a man in a wet poncho sitting in the rain keeping a promise to someone who had been ready to kill him. She did not forgive the Americans for Kenji. She was not capable of that, not tonight. Maybe not ever. The wound was too fresh and too deep, and it had her brother's name on it. But she could acknowledge in the privacy of her own mind that perhaps the category of Americans was not the same as the category of this specific American. That perhaps what had been done to Kenji had been done by forces larger than any single person, forces that swept up the willing and the unwilling alike, regardless of what was in their hearts. Perhaps some of their hearts were good. She lay back down on the bedroll. She pulled the rough blanket up to her chin. Outside, the rain continued to fall steady and indifferent, the sound of it against the canvas becoming something almost gentle. For the first time in 8 months, Yumi Asakura closed her eyes without bracing herself for what the dark might bring, and she slept. Dawn came slowly to the Texas desert, the sky moving through its gradations from black to deep blue to the particular pale grey that precedes actual light. Garrett had not slept. He rose from his position against the rock, with everything in his body complaining at once. His joints had stiffened in the cold and the damp. His fingers were barely able to close properly around the rifle. He had been sitting in the same position for 8 hours, and the desert had given him nothing to respond to. He checked the tent without entering it, soft, even breathing from inside. Good. He moved away and began building a fire, working methodically, scraping dry tinder from inside a split piece of driftwood where the moisture hadn't reached. When the fire caught, he held his hands over it and let the warmth work its way back into his fingers. The desert after rain smelled extraordinary, clean and sharp, the sage and creosote releasing something into the air that always made him think incongruously of his mother's kitchen. He filled his canteen cup with water and set it at the fire's edge to boil. From his pack, he retrieved a small packet of instant coffee, and from the very bottom, a single cube of sugar wrapped in wax paper that he had been saving for a specific occasion which had not yet presented itself. He looked at the sugar for a moment, then put it in his breast pocket. He heard movement behind him and turned, keeping his posture low and unthreatening. Yumi was standing at the tent entrance, wrapped in the military blanket, her hair come loose, the desert light making her look younger than he had realized. She looked at him, then at the fire, then at the canteen cup. He reached into his breast pocket and took out the sugar cube. He held it up so she could see it, then dropped it into the cup. Then he poured the coffee in and watched the water begin to move. She took 3 steps toward the fire, then stopped. He understood what she was doing. He had seen it in men coming back from bad places, that constant scanning, the unwillingness to let the guard down. He poured the coffee into the cup and held it out toward her. She didn't move for a long moment. Then she crossed the remaining distance and reached out and took the cup. Their fingers overlapped for less than a second. He felt her flinch at the contact and kept his own hand perfectly still until she had the cup securely. She wrapped both hands around the warm metal, raised it to her lips, closed her eyes. He watched her drink, and he saw the exact moment when something changed. Not dramatic, just a small, almost imperceptible shift in the set of her shoulders, a fractional easing of something held very tight for a very long time. And then without warning, tears began to slide down her cheeks. She was not sobbing. She was simply standing there with both hands wrapped around a tin cup of bad instant coffee with 1 cube of sugar in it, and tears were running quietly down her face. Garrett looked away. He poured himself what remained in the pot, mostly hot water, and sat back on his heels facing the fire, and drank it in silence. After a while, her breathing steadied. He pointed at himself. Garrett. She looked at him for a moment, then she pointed at herself. Yumi. And he tried to say it back to her, putting the sounds together carefully, fairly certain he got it wrong. She nodded anyway, and something that was not quite a smile moved briefly across her face and was gone. It was not much. 2 names exchanged over a bad cup of coffee in the Texas desert. But it was something. It was, without either of them knowing it yet, the first sentence of a conversation that would last 40 years. They could not stay. Garrett knew this before the fire had burned down to coals. The deserters would regroup. Men like the one with the scar did not walk away from an unfinished calculation. They would come back, and a single tent beneath a sandstone overhang would offer nothing in the way of protection. He explained the situation through gestures and simple words pointing north, sketching the outline of buildings and fences with his hands. She watched him with those careful eyes, and when he finished, she gave a single nod. They broke camp in the early morning while the desert was still cool. Yumi watched him pack and then, without being asked, folded the military blanket and placed it on top of the supply crate with a precision that told him something about who she was. He picked the blanket up and held it out to her. She hesitated for only a moment before taking it and folding it over her arm. They set out with the sun still low behind them, heading northwest. Garrett led the way, his eyes moving constantly across the terrain. Yumi followed a few steps behind, quiet in a way that was different from the silence of the previous night. The night's silence had been the silence of someone braced for impact. This was something else. The silence of a person who is revising something fundamental about the world. The desert after rain was a different place entirely. Flowers had appeared overnight, small splashes of yellow and orange and pale purple scattered across the brown sand. The air carried the smell of wet sage and something sweeter underneath some bloom Garrett had never learned the name of, but had come to think of as the smell of the desert, remembering it was alive. It saved his life at 10:30 in the morning. They were picking their way through a field of scattered boulders when Yumi's hand shot out and seized his arm with both of hers and yanked backward with a force entirely disproportionate to her size. He stumbled, caught himself, and turned. The rattlesnake was coiled in the shadow beneath the rock he had been about to step past. A western diamondback, thick through the body and nearly 5 feet long, its rattle already going that distinctive dry percussion that every creature with any instinct for self-preservation learns immediately. His right foot had been 6 inches from its striking range. The snake regarded them both with the flat, ancient patience of a thing that had been managing this desert since long before either of them arrived. Then it uncoiled in one fluid motion and disappeared between the rocks. Garrett stood very still. His heart was doing something athletic. He looked at Yumi. She was standing with her hands still extended from where she had grabbed him, her chest rising and falling quickly. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with something more like fierce concentration, the look of someone who acted first and felt the weight of it afterward. She had saved his life. He put his hand flat over his chest and bowed his head slightly, and he said the only Japanese word he knew, "Arigato." She stared at him. Something moved through her expression, complicated and quick. Then she said in English that was accented but precise, each word placed with deliberate care, "You are welcome." He blinked. She held up her thumb and forefinger, pinched almost together. Small. Learn in school. Long time. It was more than she had said to him since they had exchanged names over the fire. He understood it for what it was, not just information but a choice. She was choosing to reach across the distance between them with the limited tools she had. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it for more than the snake. She nodded once, then she gestured toward the path ahead with a small motion of her chin. They still had a long way to go. They had covered perhaps 4 more miles when Garrett saw the dust. He stopped immediately, a low brown smear against the blue sky moving fast in the east. 3 figures on horseback, closing the distance with the purposeful speed of men who knew exactly where they were going. He grabbed Yumi's arm gently, but without hesitation. "We run, now." She did not ask questions. She ran. They sprinted across the open ground toward a narrow canyon to the west. His boots hit the sand in a flat rhythm, and he heard Yumi's footsteps just behind him, quick and light, keeping pace. Behind them a shout. They had been spotted. They hit the canyon mouth and plunged into its shadow, the rock walls rising steeply on either side. Garrett pulled Yumi behind the first substantial boulder and pressed her down, then moved to a position where he could see the entrance. He checked his rifle, round in the chamber. Confirmed. The scarred man appeared at the canyon mouth, moving slower now, his rifle up his eyes, adjusting to the shadows. His 2 companions flanked him. Garrett measured angles and distances, outnumbered, responsible for someone who could not fight. The math was not comfortable. He was still running the calculations when the shot came from above, a single boom deeper and older sounding than his M1, a Winchester. The bullet struck the rock face 6 inches from the scarred man's shoulder, sending chips of stone into his face. He scrambled sideways, his composure gone. A voice came down from the rim of the canyon, deep and unhurried, with the flat vowels of a man who had spent his entire life in this particular stretch of Texas. "Vince Purnell, Earl Duckett. I've been looking for you boys for 3 months." Garrett looked up. Against the sky at the top of the canyon wall, a figure sat a horse with the easy stillness of someone who was exactly where he belonged. wide-brimmed hat. A rifle cradled across the saddle, on his chest the glint of a badge. "Kavanaugh," the man called down. "You hold down there." "Yes, sir." "Civilian with me?" "Japanese woman from the convoy attack 2 days ago." "Figured something like that. Been tracking these three since yesterday morning." His voice dropped a register. "Vince, you and your boys are going to set your weapons on the ground right now, or I am going to stop wasting good ammunition on warning shots. You've got about 5 seconds. A long silence in the canyon. The rifle hit the ground. The other two followed. "Smart," the man on the rim said without warmth. "Start walking back toward the canyon mouth." He guided his horse down a narrow trail along the canyon wall, keeping the Winchester leveled. As he passed Garrett, he glanced down and gave a single nod. "Sheriff Aldrich, get the woman to my place. My wife's been radioed. She'll have food and a bed waiting. Don't dally. These three have friends." "Yes, sir. Thank you." The sheriff's expression shifted very slightly, not quite a smile. "Thank me after. We're not done yet." Then he was gone, herding the three men out at a pace that suggested he was not interested in conversation. Garrett turned. Yumi was still behind the boulder, watching everything. He could see her processing it, fitting each piece into whatever framework she was rebuilding. "Safe now," he said. "We go to the sheriff's place. Good people. Food." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked toward him, stopped 2 feet away and bowed. A full, deliberate bow. Back straight, eyes lowered, held for a count of 3. It was the bow of someone who meant it completely. When she lifted her head, her eyes were bright. "Thank you, Garrett," she said quietly, "for everything." He did not know what to do with that. He was not a man who had ever been comfortable receiving gratitude. So he did what he usually did, which was to nod once and look at the path ahead. "Long walk still," he said. We should move." He and the Aldrich homestead sat at the edge of the desert like something that had decided to stay. A low ranch house weathered silver-gray by decades of sun and wind, solid and unpretentious. Smoke was rising from the chimney, warm light in the windows, a woman on the porch watching them come up the path. She was perhaps 50 years old, broad-shouldered, with grey streaked hair pulled back from a face lined by weather and work. She wore an apron and was wiping her hands on it as they approached, her eyes moving immediately from Garrett to Yumi and staying there. "Lord have mercy," she said quietly, then louder, "Come inside, both of you, right now." Her name was Vera Aldrich, married to Sheriff Dale Aldrich for 28 years. She had raised 3 sons on this ranch and sent 2 of them to the Pacific and received them both back, which she considered the central miracle of her life. She knew about fear. She knew about hunger. She knew exactly what she was looking at when she looked at Yumi Asakura. She led them into the kitchen. The smell hit Yumi before anything else did. Salt and smoke and fat and something baking and butter and the deep, dark undertone of coffee, already brewing, all of it layered together into something so dense and immediate that it seemed less like a smell and more like a physical presence. Her stomach responded before her mind could intervene, a deep and involuntary clench that she felt from her sternum to her knees. She had not eaten a real meal in 3 days. She had not eaten a proper meal in longer than that. Vera moved to the stove without ceremony. Bacon first, a full pan of it, the strips laid out flat, the fat rendered down to a deep amber, the edges curled and dark. Eggs fried in the bacon drippings, the whites set firm, the yolks bright as marigolds. Biscuits from the oven, their tops cracked open from the heat steam rising from the pale crumb inside. And beside each plate, a tall glass of dark liquid over ice. "Coca-Cola," Vera said, noticing Yumi's look. "You ever had it?" Yumi shook her head. "Well, there are worse times to try it for the first time than right now." Garrett was already eating with the focused single-mindedness of a man who had been awake for 36 hours. He ate without looking up, without ceremony, with the pure and uncomplicated gratitude of a person reuniting with something essential. Yumi looked at her plate. The bacon lay across it, glistening faintly. The smell of it was extraordinary salt and smoke, twisted together into something that seemed to bypass her mind entirely and go straight to somewhere older and more fundamental. She had been taught that American food was another form of American excess, wasteful and crude. She had believed this without question because she had believed most of what she had been taught without question. She picked up a strip of bacon. She looked at Vera Aldrich, who was watching her with an expression of patient, uncomplicated goodwill. She looked at Garrett, who was not watching her at all. She took a bite. The flavor arrived in layers. Salt, first sharp and immediate, then the smoke underneath it deep and slightly sweet, the taste of wood and thyme and the specific alchemy of fat, rendered slowly, over heat. Then something else, something that did not have a name, a quality of richness that seemed to coat the entire inside of her mouth and spread outward, warming something she had not realized was cold. She chewed slowly. She swallowed. And she thought about Kenji. It arrived without warning. She thought about her brother sitting in a training camp somewhere eating thin rice and whatever the army could spare. She thought about her father in the house in Kyoto, eating alone at the table where the three of them had once sat together. She thought about the fact that she was sitting in a warm kitchen in Texas with a plate of bacon in front of her, and Kenji was in the ground at 17 years old and had never sat anywhere warm and eaten anything good, and the impossibility of that arithmetic opened something in her chest that she had been keeping sealed for 8 months. She set down the bacon. She pressed her hand flat against the table. She breathed. Vera was around the table before Yumi had fully understood she was crying, an arm around her shoulders, warm and steady and without any requirement attached to it. "It's all right," Vera said quietly. "You're safe now. Whatever happened out there, it's done." Yumi did not understand every word, but she understood the arm. She understood the tone of it, the complete absence of agenda. She understood the plate of food prepared for her as a guest, rather than managed for her as a prisoner. She had been living inside a story about Americans for years. The story had been told to her so many times from so many directions with such consistency that she had stopped thinking of it as a story and started thinking of it as a description of reality. But stories required you to never be in the same room as the people the story was about. She picked the bacon back up and finished it. She ate the eggs. She ate 2 biscuits with butter that Vera pressed on her with the firm insistence of a woman who did not consider refusal a meaningful option. She drank the Coca-Cola, which was cold and sweet and startling in a way that made her understand immediately why people liked it. When she finally set down her fork, she looked at Vera Aldrich. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Vera patted her hand. "You're welcome, child. Now, let's get you cleaned up and into a proper bed." That night, Yumi slept in a real bed for the first time in months. Clean sheets, a pillow that smelled of dried lavender, a quilt stitched in a pattern of small 8-pointed stars, soft from years of washing. She thought about Garrett Kavanaugh, sitting in the rain with his rifle across his thighs. She thought about the tin of crackers placed equidistant between them. She thought about the way he had said her name over the fire carefully, the way you handle something you are not sure you have the right to hold. She reached under the pillow and felt for the stone she had been carrying since the canyon. It was not there. She had let it go somewhere along the way and had not noticed when. She did not need it anymore. The morning was clear and still. Vera had breakfast on the table before Yumi had finished washing her face, and Sheriff Aldrich arrived and ate 4 eggs without saying much, and then said he would drive them to Camp Hearn. They rode in the truck bed, Garrett and Yumi, on opposite sides, the basket Vera had packed, sitting between them. Biscuits wrapped in cloth, a jar of strawberry preserves, slices of bacon tucked between pieces of bread, 2 bottles of Coca-Cola, still cold. The desert rolled past on both sides, wide and patient, and indifferent to everything that had happened in it over the past 3 days. Yumi looked at the landscape and thought about the person she had been when she first saw it from the transport truck 4 days ago. The woman who had decided it did not matter what happened to her, who had been so full of hatred and grief that there was no room for anything else. The grief was still there, solid and permanent, with Kenji's name written through it. The anger was still there, though it had changed, shape, become less comprehensive, more specific, targeted now at something more complicated than a country. But there was also this basket, this cold bottle of Coca-Cola, the memory of Vera's arm around her shoulders, the memory of a man sitting in the rain. Camp Hearn appeared over a low rise, long wooden barracks behind chain-link fencing. Guard towers at intervals, the American flag moving slowly in the morning breeze above the main gate. This was where she would stay until the war ended. She would be processed and registered, given a number assigned a bunk. She would become a statistic. But she would be alive. And the people who had brought her here had done it without cruelty. At the gate, a young lieutenant appeared with a clipboard. Garrett spoke to him briefly. The lieutenant made notes and nodded. Garrett turned to her. She was standing very still, watching him, with those eyes that had been watching him for 3 days now. The military blanket was folded over her arm. He reached into his pack and pulled out his spare wool blanket, army issue, rough and practical. He held it out to her. "For the cold nights," he said. "Camp can get cold." She looked at the blanket. She looked at him. Her eyes were very bright. She took it. She held it against her chest with both arms, her fingers pressing into the rough wool, and she bowed. The full, deliberate bow, back straight eyes, lowered, held, for a long count of 3. Every soldier within 20 yards stopped what they were doing. When she straightened, there were tears running down her face without apology or embarrassment. "Garrett," she said softly. "Gozaimasu." He did not know the word precisely, but he knew its weight. He knew she was not thanking him for a blanket. He placed his hand over his heart. He nodded once. The lieutenant stepped forward to escort her through the gate. Yumi turned and walked toward it, the blanket held in her arms, her back straight. At the threshold, she paused for just a moment. She did not look back. She walked through the gate, and the desert wind moved between them, and the fence closed behind her, and she was gone. Garrett stood at the gate for a long time. He stood there until the truck's engine turned over behind him, and Sheriff Aldrich leaned out the window and said without impatience that they ought to be getting back. He climbed into the truck. He pulled the unfinished letter to Nora from his jacket pocket and found the pencil and added one more line at the bottom below the promise he had already written. "I met someone out here, Nora. I don't know how to explain it, but I think I understand something now that I didn't before." He folded the letter and put it away. The desert rolled past and the sun climbed, and somewhere inside the fences of Camp Hearn, a young woman from Kyoto was learning that the story she had been told about the world was only one story, and that the world itself was considerably larger and stranger and more capable of surprise than any story could contain. She still had his blanket. She would keep it for a very long time. The war ended in August of 1945. The news came over the camp loudspeakers on a hot summer afternoon. Japan had surrendered. The fighting was over. The world could begin the long and uncertain work of healing. Yumi stood in the yard with the other prisoners and listened to the announcement and tried to understand what it meant. She was going home. After everything, she was going home. But home was not the same place she had left. Kenji was still dead. Her father was still alone. And she was not the same person who had boarded that hospital ship so many months ago. The repatriation process took months. Paperwork and processing the slow logistics of moving thousands of people across an ocean. In December of 1945, Yumi Asakura boarded a ship bound for Japan. She carried almost nothing with her. A small bag of clothes, a few photographs, and a wool blanket that she had refused to leave behind. She stood on the deck as the ship pulled away from the California coast, watching America grow smaller on the horizon. The land of her enemies, the land of her saviors, the land where she had learned that nothing was as simple as she had believed. "Thank you," she whispered to the distant shore, "for everything." Then she turned and faced east toward home. The letter arrived in Columbus, Ohio in the spring of 1947. Garrett was sitting at the kitchen table when his mother brought in the mail. Bills, a circular from the hardware store, a letter from his aunt in Cleveland, and one envelope that looked different from the rest, covered in foreign stamps. The handwriting on the front, small and precise, the return address in Kyoto, Japan. He stared at it for a long moment before he opened it. To the kind soldier who sat in the rain, the letter began. "My name is Yumi Asakura. Perhaps you do not remember me, but I remember you. I will always remember you." He leaned back in his chair, the letter in his hands. He did remember her. He had thought about her often in the 2 years since the war ended, wondering what had become of her, whether she had made it home safely, whether she ever thought about those strange days in the Texas desert. Now he had his answer. He read on. "That night when you sat in the rain, you taught me something that no school could teach. You taught me that enemy is just a word. That kindness does not ask about nationality before it decides whether to act. I hated all Americans before I met you. I blamed you all for my brother's death, but you showed me that I was wrong. Not about the war, not about the bombs, but about the people. I still have the blanket you gave me. I sleep with it every night. When I hold it, I remember the coffee you made me in the morning. I remember the way you said my name. I remember that there was one American who chose to be decent when decency cost him something. Thank you, Garrett Kavanaugh. For the tent, for the rain, for everything. Yumi Asakura, Kyoto, Japan." Garrett read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it and placed it in the breast pocket of his shirt, close to where the sugar cube had been 2 years before. Nora wheeled herself into the kitchen. She looked at his face. "Who was the letter from, Garrett? You look like you've seen a ghost."
I mean, not a ghost, a friend from the war. A friend? Her eyebrows rose. "You never told me about any friends from the war." He told her the whole story. The convoy, the desert, the bandits, the tent, the night in the rain. When he finished, Nora was crying. "You have to write her back," she said. "You have to tell her you remember." I know. Promise me, Garrett. Promise me you'll write to her. He looked at his sister, at the tears on her cheeks, at the fierce determination in her eyes.
She understood, he realized. She understood what it meant to be helpless and afraid, and to have someone choose kindness instead of turning away. I promise, he said. His reply was shorter than her letter, but no less careful. Dear Yumi, of course I remember you. I could never forget. I didn't do anything special that night. I only did what my father taught me, what my mother taught me, what my sister taught me. By the way, she lived her own life without complaint. You protect the people who can't protect themselves. You share what you have. You keep your word even when no one is watching. I'm glad you kept the blanket. I'm glad you made it home. I thought about you often. I wondered if you were all right. Now I know the war is over. We are not enemies anymore. We are just two people who shared something strange and difficult and maybe a little bit beautiful. I would like to keep sharing. If you want to write again, I would like that very much. Your friend, Garrett Kavanaugh, Columbus, Ohio. The letters continued for nearly 40 years. They wrote about everything, about their families and their work and the small details of daily life, about the seasons and the way light fell differently in Ohio than in Kyoto, about memories and hopes and fears, and the particular kind of loneliness that comes from having seen too much of the world's capacity for cruelty and not enough of its capacity for grace. In 1952, Yumi wrote to tell Garrett she was getting married. His name was Hiroshi. He was a school teacher. He was gentle and patient and good. She had told him about Garrett, about the desert, about the night in the rain. Hiroshi said he wanted to meet this American someday. He wanted to thank him for saving his future wife. Garrett wrote back with congratulations and a small gift, a silver pen of the kind used for fine writing, which he had spent 2 months searching for in every stationery shop in Columbus. In 1955, Garrett wrote to tell Yumi he had a son. His name was Elliot. He had his mother's eyes and his father's stubborn streak. Garrett said he would tell Elliot about Yumi someday when the boy was old enough to understand. He would tell him about the desert and the woman who had taught him that courage was not only about fighting, but about the willingness to be changed. Yumi wrote back with congratulations and sent a small origami crane folded from paper she had made herself. In Japan, she explained cranes were symbols of peace and long life. She hoped Elliot would have both. In 1960, Garrett wrote the hardest letter of his life. Nora had died, his little sister who could not walk, the girl who had made him promise to protect the helpless. She had fought her illness for 23 years, and finally her body had given out. She was 32 years old. She read all your letters, Garrett wrote, every single one. I used to read them to her on Sunday afternoons. She said you were brave. She said you reminded her of herself. 2 women who refused to let the worst of what happened to them become the whole of who they were. Yumi wept when she read those words. She had never met Nora Kavanaugh, but she felt as though she had lost a sister. She wrote back with her condolences and a poem, a traditional Japanese verse about cherry blossoms falling in spring, beautiful and brief like all the best lives. The years moved through them both the way years do, leaving their marks. In 1972, Yumi became a grandmother. Her daughter Hanako had given birth to a baby boy. They named him Kenji after Yumi's brother who had died so long ago. In Japan, Yumi wrote to Garrett, "We believe that souls return to us, that the people we love never truly leave. Kenji is gone, but now there is a new Kenji, a little boy who will carry his name into the future." Garrett wrote back that he understood. "The names we give our children are prayers," he said. "Prayers for remembrance, prayers for hope." In 1983, they were both old. Garrett was 64, his hair white, his body slower than it used to be. Yumi was 61, her face lined with the years, but her eyes still sharp and bright. Garrett wrote, "I think about that night in the desert more now than I used to. Maybe that is what happens when you get old. You start looking backward instead of forward. I can still smell the rain. I can still hear you breathing in the tent. I can still feel the cold in my bones. But I would do it again. Every cold, wet hour of it." Yumi wrote back, "I think about you too." Why? "I think about the coffee you made me. I think about how I hated all Americans, and then I met one who changed everything." She paused with her brush hovering over the paper, and she added one more line, something she had been carrying for nearly 40 years and had never allowed herself to write. "I never told you this, but I had a stone in my hand that night. A sharp stone. I was going to use it on you if you tried to hurt me. I was ready to kill you or die trying." She had never admitted this before, not in 40 years of letters. But they were old now, and some truths could finally be spoken. Garrett's reply arrived 3 weeks later. He had read her confession, and according to his own account, laughed out loud for the first time in months. "I know," he wrote. "I saw it. You were holding it like you meant every inch of it. That is exactly why I went outside.
I figured if I stayed in the tent, you would never sleep, and you needed sleep more than I needed to be dry. Yumi stared at his words for a long time. He had known. He had known she was ready to attack him, and he had gone out into the rain anyway. Not because he was unaware of the danger, but because her need for safety was more important than his need for shelter. She picked up her brush and wrote 2 words at the bottom of her next letter, "My hero." It was the last letter Garrett Kavanaugh would ever read. He died on February 8, 1984, a heart attack, sudden and swift. He was 65 years old. His son, Elliot, found the letters in a drawer in his father's desk. Not a few letters, not a handful, 187 letters spanning 37 years, carefully arranged in chronological order, tied together with a length of brown twine, kept like the most important things are kept close and ordered and never thrown away. Elliot read them all. It took him 4 days. By the time he finished, he understood something about his father that he had never fully grasped before. Garrett Kavanaugh had been a quiet man. He rarely talked about the war. He rarely talked about himself. He did his job, raised his family, lived his life with the steady, unremarkable competence of a man who did not require an audience for the things that mattered. But he had done something extraordinary once, something that had rippled across nearly 4 decades and touched lives on the other side of the world. Elliot knew what he had to do. He sat down and wrote a letter to Kyoto. "Dear Mrs. Yumi Asakura, my name is Elliot Kavanaugh. I am the son of Garrett Kavanaugh. I am writing to tell you that my father passed away on February 8th of this year. In his final weeks, he spoke of you often. He asked me to write to you. He asked me to tell you that he never regretted that night in the desert, not for a single moment." I found your letters in his desk, all 187 of them kept in order, tied with twine. I read every one. I know the whole story now. The convoy, the bandits, the tent, the rain. My father was not a man who talked much about his feelings, but those letters told me everything I needed to know about who he was when it mattered. You were important to him. Your friendship meant more to him than I think he ever found the words to say. He kept the origami crane you sent when I was born. It sat on his desk for 29 years. Every time I asked about it, he would smile and say it was from a friend in Japan. Now I understand. I hope this letter finds you well. I hope the years have been kind to you, and I hope you know that across the ocean in a small house in Columbus, Ohio, a man spent nearly 40 years grateful for one night in the rain. With deepest respect, Elliot Kavanaugh. Yumi was 62 years old when the letter arrived. She was sitting in her garden in Kyoto, wrapped against the spring chill, in a blanket that had once been olive drab and was now faded to something closer to grey, worn thin in places but still warm, still carrying faintly the smell of dust and gun oil, and something she had never been able to fully name. She had slept with it for 39 years. Hanako brought her the letter on a tray, tea. Yumi's daughter was 32 now, her hair just beginning to show threads of grey, her face marked by time and work, and the quiet contentment of a woman who had built something worth having. She had heard the story of the American soldier many times. She knew what this letter would contain before her mother had finished the first paragraph. Yumi read it slowly, her lips moving slightly, her eyes growing wet. When she finished, she pressed the letter to her chest and closed her eyes and sat very still in the spring sunshine with the old blanket around her shoulders and the garden quiet around her. Garrett was gone. The man who had sat in the rain for her, the man who had made her coffee and given her his blanket and called her his friend and kept every letter she had ever written. The man who had known she was holding a stone and had gone out into the rain anyway. Gone. She sat in her garden for a long time. Then she called for Hanako. "I need you to help me do something," she said. "Something important." Hanako knelt beside her mother's chair. "Anything." Yumi looked at her daughter with clear, steady eyes. The eyes of a woman who had made peace with most of the things life had required her to make peace with and was not finished yet. "I want you to find his son, and I want you to invite him here, to this house, to this garden." "But mother," because some stories are not finished until you meet face to face. She smiled, and it was a sad smile, but also a peaceful one, the smile of someone who understands that grief and gratitude are not opposites. "I am too old to travel, but he is not, and there is something I need to give him, something his father would have wanted him to have." Hanako looked at the blanket wrapped around her mother's shoulders. She understood. "I will find him," she said. "I promise." The meeting happened in the spring of 2001. Elliot Kavanaugh was 46 years old when he finally traveled to Kyoto. He carried with him a small wooden box. Inside was a portion of his father's ashes, a small amount that the family had kept aside for exactly this purpose, without quite articulating why, and the wool army blanket that had made a round trip across the Pacific and back.
Yumi had sent it to Columbus after receiving news of Garrett's death in 1984, keeping her promise to return it. But she had included a note asking if someday, if it was not too much to ask, someone might bring it back to her one more time. Elliot had promised himself he would fulfill that request. It had taken 17 years, but he was here. Hanako met him at the airport in Tokyo. She was 49 herself, her English fluent, her manner warm and quietly formal in the way of someone who was being careful with something fragile. They recognized each other from the photographs they had exchanged. Two strangers connected by a story that had begun before either of them existed. "My mother has been counting the days," Hanako said. They took the bullet train to Kyoto. Elliot watched the Japanese countryside move past the window, the mountains and the rice fields, and the cities pressed against the edges of the land, and thought about his father. Garrett had never come here, had never seen the country whose language he could not speak, but whose people had given him one of the most important friendships of his life. "I am seeing it for you, Dad," Elliot thought. "I am finishing what you started." The house was small and traditional, with sliding paper doors and a garden that showed decades of patient tending. It looked like something preserved, a piece of old Japan held carefully in the middle of a modern city. Hanako led him through the gate and into the garden. Under a cherry tree in full bloom, an old woman sat in a chair, wrapped in a faded olive-grey blanket. She was 79 years old, and her white hair was pulled back from a face deeply lined by time, but her eyes, when she looked up at him, were clear and sharp and immediate. Elliot stopped a few feet away. He bowed the way his father had described in one of his letters, the full and deliberate bow. "Mrs. Asakura," he said, "I am Elliot Kavanaugh, Garrett's son." Yumi looked up at him, her eyes moving across his face with the careful attention of someone searching for something specific.
"You have his eyes," she said softly. "Exactly his eyes." Elliot felt something shift in his chest. "Thank you. That means more than I can say." He knelt beside her chair and opened the wooden box. Inside, nestled against a piece of dark cloth, was a small urn, and folded beside it, the blanket. "I brought him to you," Elliot said. "A part of him, anyway. He would have wanted to be here. He would have wanted to see you one more time." Yumi reached out with trembling fingers and touched the urn. Then she touched the blanket. Her hand rested on the rough wool for a long moment. "I kept this for 39 years, she whispered. "Every night I slept with it. Every night I remembered." "I know, he kept every letter you ever wrote, all 187, tied with twine and kept in order." Yumi closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, they were wet but steady. "Your father saved my life," she said. "Not just from the men in the desert, from myself, from my hatred. I was so full of anger when I met him. I blamed all Americans for my brother's death. I thought you were all the same, all responsible, all guilty." She paused. "But Garrett showed me that one person can represent something larger than a country, that one act of decency offered without any expectation of return can crack open a lifetime of certainty." She reached out and took Elliot's hand in both of hers. Her hands were small and thin with age, but her grip was firm. "I want you to tell your children something," she said. "Tell them this story. Tell them the whole thing from the beginning, the ambush and the desert and the tent and the rain and all 40 years after. Tell them so that it is not lost." Elliot squeezed her hand gently. "I will, I promise." They sat together in the garden as the afternoon light moved through its long golden descent toward evening. Hanako brought tea, and they drank it in comfortable silence, watching the cherry blossoms drift down from the branches above each one, briefly perfect before the ground received it. Later, as the sun began to set, Yumi asked Elliot to scatter some of his father's ashes in the garden. "Let him stay here," she said. "Let a part of him rest in Japan. He was a bridge between our countries, a bridge made not from politics or treaties, but from one man's decision on one night in the rain. Let him be that bridge always." Elliot walked to a quiet corner of the garden near a stone lantern, dark with years of weather, and scattered a handful of ashes among the spring flowers. "Rest easy, Dad," he said quietly. "You've finally made it to Japan." That night it rained. A soft spring rain, gentle and warm, the kind that nourishes rather than destroys. The kind that washes the world clean and leaves everything sharper and more present in the morning. Yumi sat by the window in her bedroom, watching the rain fall on her garden. The wool blanket was draped across her shoulders, returned to her at last. In her lap was the small urn. She was thinking about the night in the desert, the tent, the fear, the stone in her hand, the American soldier who had walked out into the storm because he had told her she would be safe, and he had meant it in the simplest and most complete way possible.
You will sleep in my tent. Not a threat. Never a threat. A promise, an act of grace that had echoed across 60 years and changed 2 lives and was now being passed into the hands of a 3rd generation to carry forward. She closed her eyes. In her mind, she was 23 again, huddled in the corner of a canvas tent, watching through a gap in the fabric as a man sat in the downpour with a rifle across his lap and refused to come inside. She had not understood then. She had been too afraid, too full of hate, too certain of what she knew. But she understood now. She had spent nearly 60 years understanding it through letters and memories, and the slow, patient work of allowing one person's decency to revise everything she had been certain of. Garrett Kavanaugh had taught her the most important lesson of her life. The lesson was simple, durable. It did not require elaboration. People are not their countries. Individuals cannot be held responsible for the actions of armies. Kindness requires courage. And sometimes courage is as small and as large as giving up your shelter for someone who needs it more than you do. She opened her eyes and looked at the urn in her lap. "Thank you, Garrett," she said quietly, to the rain, to the garden, to the blanket that still smelled faintly of the Texas desert, even after all these years. "For the tent, for the rain, for teaching me how to see past the uniform," to the man wearing it. She paused, and a small smile moved across her weathered face. "I kept my promise. I found you. I thanked you properly. And now finally we are in the same place at the same time." She lifted the urn and pressed her lips to its cool surface. "Good night, my friend. Sleep well." Outside, the rain continued to fall, soft and steady, like something the world had decided it needed to say and was taking its time saying it. Yumi Asakura died 7 months later, in November of 2001. She was 79 years old. They found her in her bed in the morning, the faded wool blanket pulled up to her chin, the small urn held in both hands against her chest. On her face was an expression of such complete peace that Hanako stood in the doorway for a long moment before she could move, not wanting to disturb it. Hanako honored her mother's final wish. She scattered Yumi's ashes in the same garden where Elliot had scattered Garrett's, near the stone lantern among the flowers that bloomed each spring without being asked. The cherry tree flowered that year with particular abundance, the branches so heavy with blossoms that they bent toward the ground as if bowing, and the petals fell for days, covering the garden in something that looked from a distance like snow. The story passed into family memory on both sides of the ocean. Hanako told it to her son Kenji and her other children. Elliot told it to his own children. At family gatherings in both Ohio and Kyoto, when someone asked about the old photographs of the origami crane that sat in a glass case on a shelf, the story would be told again from the beginning. The convoy in the Texas desert. The 3 days alone in the heat. The man with the stone. The shot in the sand. The tent. The rain. The coffee, the bacon, the blanket. The bacon. The 40 years of letters tied with brown twine. And the lesson that Yumi Asakura had spent the better part of her life trying to carry across an ocean and offer to anyone who would receive it. That enemies are only strangers we have been told to fear before we have had the chance to know them. That war is made by the decisions of the powerful, but its meaning is made by the choices of ordinary people in ordinary moments. That history is not only the record of battles and borders and the movements of armies, it is also the record of a man in a wet poncho sitting in the rain in the Texas desert, cold and exhausted, and keeping his word to someone who was ready to kill him. It is the record of the stone that was not thrown. It is the record of the blanket that was given. It is the record of the first letter that arrived in Columbus, Ohio in the spring of 1947, addressed in small, precise handwriting to the kind soldier who sat in the rain. And it is the record of the reply that was sent, and the reply to the reply, and all the replies after that 187 letters in all, kept in order, and tied with twine carried across decades and an ocean, because someone had decided that the person on the other end of them was worth knowing, and had been right. 5 words spoken in broken English on a dusty desert evening. You will sleep in my tent. Not a threat, a promise, a light in the darkness, a bridge across the impossible. And proof for anyone who needed it that even in the worst chapters of human history, the capacity for simple decency survives. That one person at the right moment making the right choice can change the course of 2 lives and the lives that come after them. That the desert is merciless, yes. But so is grace in its own way, relentless, patient, refusing to be extinguished. That is the story of Garrett Kavanaugh and Yumi Asakura, a soldier and a nurse, an American and a Japanese. 2 people who should have been enemies and became across 40 years and an ocean, and all the distance that history had placed between them, Something rarer and more durable than that. Friends.